Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, 19a of Maseches Kiddushin. We are 6 lines down on the page. First we're on the line is Ishus, and we're in the middle of the line where it says Ba'i Reish Lakish, which means Reish Lakish posed the following question. Mahu shemiyayid Adam livno katan? What is the halacha regarding whether a man can designate his maidservant for marriage to his child who is still a minor? So the halacha is that a man who acquires a maidservant is allowed to marry her, and he can also marry her off to his son. So Reish Lakish's question was, can he marry and designate her as a wife to his son, even if that son is a minor, is under bar mitzvah? So what's the question? So he explains, because the pasuk says, it mentions this possibility of livno yadena, he'll designate her to his son. So he wants to know, bino amar achmana bino koldu. It says to his son, the Torah says to his son, and that can be any son, any age, even a minor. O dilma, or maybe bino dum yodidei, that the son has to be similar to him. They're mahu gadol, just like if he would marry her, that's because he is a gadol, he is an adult. So af bino gadol, so too, if he would marry her off to his son would also have to be a gadol, would have to be a adult. So that was Reish Lakish's question. So Amar Rabbi Zera said, Tashma, come and listen to the following brisa. The brisa says, here it's dealing with a pasuk about adultery. The pasuk says, V'ish asher yinaf es eishes ish. If a man will commit adultery with a married woman. So it says, ish, a man, prat lekatan, to the exclusion of a katan, of a child. Meaning, this is talking about where the end of the verse says that if they, assuming all the conditions are met, but a man and a woman who commit adultery are put to death. So we learn first of all, ish prat lekatan. It has to be a man as opposed to a child. If a child would be with a married woman, if a minor would be with a married woman, then they would not be put to death. Asher yinafes eishes ish, prat le'eishes katan. And the second condition it mentions is, it's a man with a eishes ish, with the wife, literally a married woman, literally eishes ish, the wife of a man, that it has to be a man, she has to be the wife of a man, prat, to the exclusion of eishes katan, that she's the wife of a katan, of a child. So two conditions that the brisa mentions. Number one, that in order for them to be put to death, it has to be that the man in the adultery is a man and not a child. And secondly, the woman has to be married to a man and not married to a child. V'i amart meyayid. And if you'll tell me that the child, in our case of the maidservant, that the father, the master, can marry the maidservant to a child even when the child is a katan, if that were true, says Rabbi Zera, imkain, if that's so, matzinu ishus lekatan, then we have a case where you have a katan, you have a child who's actually married, and he says, and therefore I don't understand. There you have a legitimate marriage, apparently, if it was true, if it's true that the father, the master, can designate his maidservant to marry his child, his son, even if he's a minor, then you would have a legitimate marriage. And if you have a legitimate marriage, says Rabbi Zera, then I don't understand, why would it be that if a man commits adultery with with the wife of such a child, meaning in this case it would be that maidservant who's now married to the child, why would it not be a full-fledged adultery? That's liable for the death penalty. So says Rabbi Zera, it must be from the fact that there's no the Torah excludes the child, the adultery that involves a woman who's married to a child, it must be that there's no legitimate way for a child to be married, and therefore it can't be that you can have yiyud, that the master can marry his maidservant off to his son who's a minor. So the Gemara says back, so let me go the other way. It says, if you're telling me that he can't, and that there's no legitimate marriage for a minor, so then, then why does the Torah have to exclude that case from adultery? Right? Why is it necessary for the Torah to say that if you have a woman who's married to a minor and she commits adultery with a man, then they're not killed because she's only married to a minor? Well, if she can't be actually married to a minor, then that's obvious. If there's no case where she could be legitimately, legally married to a minor, then you don't have to exclude that case from that woman from adultery. She's not actually married. So, of course she's excluded. She's not married. So we're taking the logic in the opposite direction and saying it must be that there is a legitimate way. Tifshot mina demiyayid. And so we should learn from there that the father could designate his maidservant to marry his son who's a minor, and that's the case where you'll find that a minor can be married, and that's what needs to be excluded from the case of adultery. So Rav Ashi says, no, there's a different case that we can use, that we can say is what's being excluded from adultery. Hacha here, biyavam ben tesha shanim v'yom echad, haba al yavimto askinan. We're dealing with a case where you had a yavam, you had a levirate marriage situation, so a man died without children, and his wife now has to marry her husband's brother, or get chalitza, and that brother is 9 years old. Now a 9-year-old, the Gemara understands, is capable of engaging in biyah, in intercourse, and that's all that's needed to do yibum. And we don't need him to be a gadol. This is the one exception. He doesn't have to be an adult. Even a child, as long as he's over 9, can fulfill yibum if he engages in relations with the yavama, with the widow. So that's the case. D'midoraisa chazilei. That there, it's fitting midoraisa. According to Torah law, he could marry her. He could do yibum, and they would be fully married in halacha. Almost. So there, that's where Mao Detema, what would you have said? That came in the Midaraisa Chazyole. Since Midaraisa, according to the Torah, they are fit to marry in this situation. Ubia sobia. And his intercourse is intercourse. And therefore, even a 9-year-old who's a katan, who's a child, can do yibum and be married to the yavama. So you might say they're fully married. And therefore, haba aleha, and if now she would go and commit adultery, the man and her really would be liable for committing adultery. Kamash Malan, that's what the Torah here is teaching me, that no. That when it says Abal Ishis Ish, it says that Isha Shayinov is Ishis Ish, that a man who has adultery with the wife of a man, that's where they're liable to be killed. But if she's not the wife of a man, she's the wife of a child. In this one case that we have, where she can be married to a child, which is the case where he was at least 9 years old, and he did yibum. So there, although they're considered halachically married, midoraisa, even according to the Torah, but still, the laws of adultery don't apply to her. As long as she's still married to a child, we're not saying it's permitted, but it wouldn't be chayiv misa. They wouldn't be killed for that. Okay, now the Gemara cuts back the original question. It says, "My have Allah." So what happened with that? In other words, what about the original question, Reish Lakish's question, which was, can a master marry his maidservant off to his son who's still a minor? So the Gemara says, Tashma, come and listen. Amar Rav Ivo, Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rav Ivo said in the name of Rabbi Yanai, Ein Yiyud Ela Begadol. No, Yiyud, this designation of marriage of the maidservant to a man, to either the master or his son, is only by a gadol, only by an adult. And Ein Yiyud Ela Midas. And also, it's only with consent, with knowledge. Someone who has the knowledge to consent. So the Gemara says, Tarti, do I need both things? That's saying the same thing. Who is it that has knowledge to consent? That's a gadol, that's an adult. So to say that Yiyud, that this designation, this marriage of the maidservant, is only to an adult, and it's only to someone who has das, who has the knowledge to give consent, well, that's the same thing. So the Gemara says, Tarti, do I need to say it twice? So the Gemara says, Ma tam kamar. The Gemara is explaining, the Brisa was explaining the reason, Rav Ivo, the name of Rabbi Yanai, was explaining the reason that Ma tam and Yiyud el begadol. What is the reason why I'm saying that Yiyud can only be with a gadol? That the maidservant can only marry someone who's an adult? The reason is, the reason is because you need his consent. You need him to have the das, to have the knowledge to be able to consent. And that's why it has to be a gadol. So it was explaining the reason why. It wasn't saying it twice, it wasn't repeating itself. It was saying he has to be a gadol, he has to be an adult because he has to have das, because he has to have the ability to consent. That's one understanding. And if you want, you can say a different answer. Why does it say it twice? Why does it say he has to be a gadol, he has to be an adult, and it has to, or ein yiyud ela begadol, that yiyud is only true for a gadol. This designation of marriage of a maidservant is only for an adult, and only midas. Why does it say it twice? Because it's talking about midas dida. It's talking about her das, not the man's. The maidservant. It has to be midas dida. It has to be with her consent. Detangi Abaye breder Rabbi Abo, because Abaye, the son of Rabbi Abo, taught Asher lo ye'ada, that the pasuk says, it talks about a case where actually the man did not marry the maidservant. Lo ye'ada, he didn't designate her. Melamid shetzarech liyada. This teaches us that he needs to be meyayid her. He has to designate her. Now, what does that mean? It's not clear. There is a girsa here that somehow, like the Rashash, which instead of saying liyada, it says liyada. The dalet before the ayin, and that means to know that to get her knowledge, to get her consent. So Abaye, in the name of Rabbi Abo, is saying that this pasuk Asher lo ya'ada is indicating that she has to consent. And so when it's said in the Brisa that it has to be that there's only yud for a gadol, and there's only yud with consent, it wasn't talking about that the man, that he has to not only be a gadol, but the reason is because he has to consent. That was our first explanation. But he has to have das, the knowledge, to know what he's doing. The second approach is that she has to consent. Which I think would mean that she has to be at least 12. So even though she could be younger when she's sold as a maidservant, and she goes free when does she go free already at 12? I don't remember. So I think she goes free at 12 and a half, but now I'm not remembering for sure. In any event, it's saying that we need her das. That to me implies that she would have to be at least a gedola. She has to be an adult to give her consent. That's what it's saying now. Now, the Gemara goes on. It says, elaborates on this thing. It says, Hutani la v'hu amar la. So Abaye, the son of Rabbi Abo, he taught this, and he also, I guess, explained it. That b'kiddusha yiyud, that we're talking about kiddusha yiyud. We're talking about when do we say that she has to, this idea that we need her consent. So when is she consenting? She's consenting to the Kiddushin of Yiyud. The Kiddushin of that marriage, when she, as a maidservant. And why do we need her consent? Why do we need her agreement? Ve'aliba de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because we would be going in the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, which we talked about last week, who holds the Amar Mos Harishonos Lav Kiddushin Nitnu. He holds that the money that the master paid to purchase the maidservant, that's not the money for Kiddushin. We're going to see in a moment that somebody says that it is, meaning that the other way to understand it is when the master, where's the Kiddushin here? How does the master marry her? Or his son? So the idea is that he paid money to the father to purchase her, and that's the Kiddushin money. That's one way of looking at it. But Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says no. Mos Harishonos Lav Kiddushin Nitnu. That original money is not the Kiddushin money. And the Kiddushin, it seems, happens based on that when the master marries her, so he's freeing her, so to speak, from her shibud, from her need to serve him. She's now an equal, somewhat. She's a wife. So instead of being a maidservant. So that value of what he's freeing her from is where the Kiddushin is. But that's her acceptance. So therefore, if you understand that he's paying the father for Kiddushin, you don't need her das. You have the father's agreement. You need someone's agreement. So you have the father's. But if it's not the original money, but rather it's him being Mekadesh her now, later, so then he needs her agreement. He needs her consent. So she would have to have das. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Afilu temel Kiddushin nitnu. No. He says, even if you say that the original money, the Mos Harishonos, is the Kiddushin, you can still understand this concept here that you need her das, that you need her consent. Shani hacha d'amar Rachmana ya'ada, because here it's different because the Torah said ya'ada, he will, again, designate her, and it's not so clear to me how that implies that you need her consent, but that's what it implies. So he's saying that, so Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is essentially saying that you don't need to come on to the idea that the original money is not the Kiddushin. And that's because, by the way, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, we mentioned it at the top of the page, this was in the end of last week's Gemara, that even Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda holds that the Mos Harishonos are Kiddushin. So there is nobody who holds that's not the Kiddushin money. According to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, everybody agrees that the money that the father receives is the Kiddushin money. And so if you have his consent, why do you need her consent? So that he says that's because the Torah has a special drasha over here. It says, Asher lo ya'ada, that he didn't designate her, but that implies that you need her das, you need her consent. So here, you need her consent. Okay, now the Gemara says, My Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. What is this Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda that we've been referring to? We referred to last week, you just referred to it now, that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda holds that the original money that the father received is not the Kiddushin money. What is this Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda? Where do we find it? So the Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Ya'ada v'hefta. It says in the pasuk that Asher lo Ya'ada, that if he didn't marry her, he didn't designate her for marriage, v'hefta, and she was redeemed from him. This teaches me Tzarech she'ishahus b'yom k'dei p'diyah. This teaches me that there has to be, in order for him to marry her, there's a connection here between the yud and the p'diyah. That the Bryce is saying that in order for there to be yud, in order for there to be marriage, it has to be possible to have hefta. It has to be possible to have redemption, that she could be redeemed. Hefta means that she would be redeemed. But there's a connection here that's being made, which is that in order to marry her, it has to be possible that she be redeemed. Why? Because the minimal amount of money that he could pay to redeem her would be the smallest currency value, which is a pruta. So, which is a pruta. So, sorry, excuse me. excuse me, that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is we know that Kiddushin is a pruta. So the value of the Kiddushin, in order for him to marry her, there has to be a pruta worth of value here. Where does the value come from? So I mentioned earlier that the way that he, if it's not the original money that was given to the father, that's the Kiddushin money. So where's the Kiddushin money? It's when he redeems her, or when he marries her, he frees her from servitude. So as long as that servitude that he's freeing her from is worth at least a pruta, then that has a value. That's the Kiddushin. That which he's freeing her from, her shibud, from her servitude, is the Kiddushin. That's how he's marrying her. But that's only if that servitude is worth at least a pruta, which means there has to be, if it would be the last day, she's about to be freed, it's the end of 6 years, or she's reached the age where she's free. She's about to be free. It's the end of the day. And the amount of servitude left her is worth less than a pruta, then he can't marry her. That's what it's saying here. That melamed, that this connection between yud and pedia, between the marriage and the redemption, is teaching us there has to be enough time left in the day to redeem her for a pruta. That she's still worth, the work that's left on her contract, so to speak, is worth at least a pruta. That way, when he now marries her instead, she's receiving a pruta of value. So Mikan, Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, it was about this. That Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda said, Im yeshos b'yom k'dei lasos imo shava pruta mikudeshes. So right, so the Brisa didn't really say the amount. It just said k'dei pedia, enough to redeem her. So Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda said that what that's saying, I guess he's explaining it, is that there has to be enough to that she could work, that the value of her work that remains in her contract, in her term, is worth a pruta. Then mikudeshes. Then there's kiddushin. Then they could be married. Ve'im lav, and if not, if there's not enough time, eina mikudeshes, then she's not mikudeshes. It doesn't work. So that's what Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda said. So Alma, so says the Gemara, we see kasavar that he holds mos harishonos lavu kiddushin nitnu, that the original money wasn't the kiddushin. From the fact that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda insists that there has to be at least a pruta left now, if her value, that's because the original money wasn't the kiddushin. If the original money was the kiddushin, then it shouldn't have to be that there's a pruta. In other words, it's true the Torah seems to have a drasha that says that in order for him to marry her, there has to be enough time left for her to be redeemed. The Torah didn't say how much time. Comes along Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and says what it's really saying is there has to be a pruta left, because that's the kiddushin. That's at least how the Gemara is understanding it now. That's the kiddushin. It's not the original money. So therefore there has to be at least a pruta left of time. So that's where we see Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda holds that the original money that was given to the father is not the kiddushin money. And here is where Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar afilu teimul kiddushin no. No, even if you say that the original money that the father received was the kiddushin money, still, even Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda could agree to that. And shani hachad amar achmana vehefta. And even though that's the kiddushin money, but here we still have this added requirement that there has to be time left in the day to redeem her in order for the man to marry her, in order for the master to marry her, and that's because the Torah says so. It says Yada v'efta connects the marriage to the redemption, so there has to be enough time left to marry her, and why does Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda say that it has to be at least a pruta? I suppose he's saying there's a minimal value. It's not just when we say that there has to be enough time left in the date for it to be redeemed. It's not saying even a second. It could be redeemed at the last second. It must be saying something of significance. So a pruta worth. But not because, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, not because Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda holds that that's the kiddushin money. He agrees the kiddushin money is the original money that the master gave the father. But that's because it says in the Torah, it says, Ye'adav efton, we connect the marriage to the possibility of redemption. Therefore, there has to be at least that possibility of redemption, while she's still, her value, her work is still worth at least a pruta. Okay, 2 dots. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Rava saying in the name of Rav Nachman. Omer Adam Levito Ketana Tz'i v'kibli Kiddushech. He says a man can tell his daughter, go and accept your Kiddushin. That even though she's a Ketana, even though she's a child, she's able to be the one to accept the Kiddushin, if the father instructs her to. How do we know? Mid Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, we can learn it from Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda that we just talked about. Because remember, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, at least in our original understanding of him, holds that this maidservant is the one receiving the Kiddushin herself. It's not the father. The original money is not the money for Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Lav Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, didn't Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda say, Mo Sarishonos Lav Kiddushin Nitnu, that the original money that the master gives to the father is not the Kiddushin money. And as long as she has at least a pruta worth of work left in her term, then that could be the Kiddushin. But she's the one accepting it, even though she's a child. So hachanami loshna. So too over here, there's no difference. That we can view that idea that the father marries her off as a maidservant and then she is able to accept the Kiddushin as basically the father saying, I'm putting you in position that you can now accept Kiddushin. So too in a regular case. Says Rava, in the name of Rav Nachman, we see from here that the father has the ability to say to his daughter, you can go and receive the Kiddushin. Amar Rav Nachman. Another thing that Rava said in the name of Rav Nachman is Hamakadesh b'milveh sheyesh aleh mashka mikudeshes. That if a man is makadesh a woman with a loan that has a mashka, that has collateral, she is mikudeshes. So I think the idea here is that if a man lent a woman money, and she gave an object for collateral, and now he says, I'm going to forgive your loan. So he says, I think he's giving back the collateral. If he gives back the collateral, she is mikudeshes. She is betrothed. Midir Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And how do we know that? From Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Because the Lav Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Didn't Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda say, Mos Harishonos Lav Kiddushin Nitnu? The original money is not the Kiddushin money. The money the master gave for the maidservant to purchase the maidservant to the father is not the Kiddushin money. So how do we look at it? So Hai Havahi. So we look at it somewhat like the idea of a maidservant is almost like a loan that he gave the father money, and as she works, she's really paying back the loan. But also v'hi gufa mashkohi, but she's the collateral. She is the collateral. He's holding her as property until the money that he gave the father is fully paid back, until the loan is fully paid back. V'chi meshayer b'shava pruta, but as long as there's at least a pruta worth left in her value, umeyayed, and then he designates her, and then he marries her, havu kiddushin. Then that's kiddushin. So he sort of gives her back to herself. She's the collateral on the loan to make sure that she'll work, and now he gives her back to herself, so to speak, because he says, you're free. You have to marry me, but you're free. You're no longer a maidservant. So hachanami loshna. So by a collateral, it should be no different. So by returning that mashkon, by returning the collateral, that's similar to how the man now is returning her to herself. Right now, he has her as collateral, and she owes him a certain amount of work still. But now he's saying, okay, you can have yourself back, and that's the Kiddushin. He's freeing her from her shibud, from her servitude. So too, anytime, says Rava, the name of Nachman, anytime somebody gives back collateral on a loan, that itself could serve as the Kiddushin, just like over here, where he's giving back the collateral by giving her back to herself. That serves as the Kiddushin, according to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda holds that that's the Kiddushin. It's not the original money that was given from the master to the father.